The little girl's voice cried out as she grabbed the giant cowboy's sleeve outside the saloon. "Please, sir, my sister is trapped in the mine." What Josiah Stone did next, dropping to one knee before the trembling child with tears streaming down his scarred face, would bring the hardest men in Silver Ridge to their knees. Josiah Stone had been a fixture in Silver Ridge for 5 years, a mountain of a man who stood 6 feet 8 inches tall, with shoulders broad enough to block a doorway, and hands that could bend horseshoes without effort. Yet in all that time nobody had heard him speak more than a handful of words or seen any expression cross his weathered face, beyond the blank mask of a man who had buried something too painful to resurrect. The afternoon sun beat down on the dusty main street where Emma Hartwell, a wisp of a girl barely reaching his belt buckle, had grabbed the sleeve of his worn leather duster with both her small hands, her face streaked with tears and dirt, her voice breaking on every word as she begged him for help that everyone else in town had already refused to give. When Josiah dropped to one knee in the middle of the street, his massive frame folding down until he was nearly eye level with the desperate child, the poker game inside the Copper Bell Saloon came to an immediate halt as men rushed to the windows and spilled out onto the wooden boardwalk to witness what they could scarcely believe. His calloused hands, scarred from years of ranch work and whatever had come before, trembled visibly as he gripped Emma's thin shoulders with a gentleness that seemed impossible for someone his size, and when he spoke, his voice came out rough and cracking like a rusty gate finally opened after years of disuse. "How long has she been down there?" he asked, and the simple question carried such weight of emotion that several of the saloon patrons felt their own throats tighten in response. Emma's words tumbled out between sobs about her sister Clara trapped in that collapsed mine for 2 hours already, and as she spoke, something fundamental shifted in Josiah's granite features. Tears began to stream down his scarred face, cutting clean tracks through the dust that clung to his weathered skin, and the sight of the legendary giant weeping openly in the street sent a ripple of shock through the growing crowd that pressed closer to witness this impossible moment. Old Pete Mackenzie, who had known Josiah since he first arrived in Silver Ridge 5 years ago carrying nothing but grief and silence, grabbed the arm of the man beside him and whispered that he had never seen Josiah show any feeling at all, not joy or anger or sorrow, nothing but that terrible blank emptiness that made folks keep their distance. But here he was, this enormous Maitland man who had become almost a myth in the town's collective consciousness, kneeling in the dirt before a child and weeping like his heart was breaking all over again, for reasons the crowd could only guess at but somehow understood in their bones meant something profound was about to happen. And now's the time to stop and subscribe to our channel. Every subscriber brings us closer to 1,000, which helps us keep these stories alive and coming your way. If you enjoyed this video, don't forget to like it and drop a comment telling us where you're watching from. It's always amazing to see how far these tales travel across the world. Now let's continue. Emma's words came out in a torrent between heaving sobs as she explained that Clara had gone into the old Whitmore mine just after noon, nearly 2 hours past now, searching for their father's battered tin lunch pail that he had carried every day before the accident 3 years ago took him from them in a logging camp up north. The girl's small body shook as she described how Clara had been talking about the lunch pail for weeks, saying it was the only thing of Papa's they had left besides his pocket watch that Uncle Silas had already sold for drinking money, and how Clara figured the pail might still be near the entrance where Papa used to sit during his breaks when he worked the Whitmore before it closed down. Emma had begged her sister not to go into the abandoned mine, had pulled on her skirt and cried and promised to help look anywhere else. But Clara was 15 and stubborn and determined to have something of their father's to hold on to now that Mama was gone too, taken by winter fever just last year, that left them orphaned and alone. The entrance had looked stable enough, Emma continued, her voice dropping to a whisper as guilt washed over her tear-stained features. Just a small opening between 2 support beams that Clara thought she could slip through quick as a rabbit, grab the lunch pail if it was still there, and come right back out before anyone even knew they had been near the dangerous site. But Emma had heard the rumbling sound like distant thunder, had seen the dust cloud billow out from the mine entrance, and when she ran closer, all she could see was a wall of collapsed rock and timber where her sister had disappeared, and Clara's faint voice calling for help from somewhere deep in the darkness beyond. She had run straight to their Uncle Silas first, Emma admitted with a bitterness that seemed too old for her 8 years, had pounded on the door of his room above the general store and screamed that Clara was trapped, but he had opened the door reeking of whiskey and told her that foolish girls deserve what they get for disobeying rules and trespassing on dangerous property. Emma had tried the sheriff next, but he was 2 towns over dealing with a cattle dispute and wouldn't be back until tomorrow at the earliest, and then she had run to the mine foreman and the mayor and anyone else she could think of, but they all said the same thing about the Whitmore being too unstable, too dangerous, that attempting a rescue would likely kill whoever tried it, and maybe bring down the whole hillside in the process. So Emma had stood in the middle of the street outside the saloon crying and lost until she saw Josiah Stone walking past, this giant of a man she'd seen around town but never heard speak, and something in her desperate heart told her that if anyone could save Clara, it would be him. Gerald Hutchins had been mine foreman in Silver Ridge for 23 years, and he knew every shaft and tunnel within 50 miles like other men knew their own homes. So when he heard the commotion in the street and learned that someone was talking about going into the Whitmore, he pushed through the gathering crowd with the authority of a man who had seen too many good people die underground to let foolishness claim more lives. He was a compact man with a grey beard and eyes that had witnessed horrors most folks couldn't imagine, and when he reached the centre of the circle where Josiah still knelt beside Emma, his voice carried the weight of absolute certainty when he declared that any rescue attempt was impossible, and anyone who tried it was signing their own death warrant. The Whitmore mine had been officially closed for a decade, Hutchins explained to the crowd. Ever since the cave-in of 1875 that had killed 12 men in a single afternoon, when a support beam failed in the main shaft and brought down half the mountain on top of them, and in the years since, the entire tunnel system had become increasingly unstable with winter freezes and spring thaws, weakening what little structural integrity remained. Hutchins locked eyes with Josiah as he spoke, and there was recognition there, a shared knowledge of that terrible day 10 years ago when both of them had been part of the desperate rescue effort that had recovered only bodies, never survivors. And when Hutchins mentioned that disaster, several people in the crowd who remembered glanced at Josiah with new understanding of why the giant cowboy had tears on his face. The foreman continued his grim assessment, explaining that the Whitmore's main shaft had multiple branches, any one of which could collapse if disturbed, and that the entrance where Clara was trapped sat directly beneath a section of tunnel that had been showing cracks and instability for years before they sealed it off. Any attempt to dig through the collapsed entrance would create vibrations that would travel through the rock, Hutchins warned, and those vibrations would almost certainly trigger a cascade failure that would bring down not just the entrance tunnel but potentially the entire eastern shaft system, burying anyone inside under thousands of tons of rock and earth. He had seen it happen before at other mines, had pulled dead rescuers from collapsed tunnels where they had died trying to save people who were already beyond help. And he would not sanction or support any attempt to go into the Whitmore no matter how much a little girl cried or how much it pulled at everyone's heartstrings. The crowd murmured in agreement with Hutchins because he was the expert and his word on mining matters was law in Silver Ridge, but Emma let out a wail of despair that cut through the discussion like a knife, and Josiah slowly rose to his full towering height, his eyes never leaving the foreman's face, and everyone who saw his expression knew that Gerald Hutchins had just told him something he was prepared to ignore. Josiah rose slowly from his kneeling position, unfolding his massive frame inch by inch, until he stood at his full imposing height of 6 feet 8 inches, towering over every person in the gathered crowd like an ancient oak among saplings. And when he looked down at Emma with an expression that mixed terrible grief with iron determination, his voice came out rough and breaking as he said the words that would change everything. "I'll bring your sister home." The simple declaration hung in the afternoon air for a moment before its full meaning registered, and then the crowd gasped collectively as if someone had struck them all in the chest at once, because everyone in Silver Ridge knew the story of Josiah Stone even if they had never heard him speak it aloud. Martha Henderson grabbed her husband's arm and whispered that Josiah had lost his own brother in the Whitmore disaster 10 years back. And old Pete Mackenzie nodded solemnly, because he had been there that awful day, and watched a 22-year-old Josiah dig with his bare hands through rock and timber for 3 solid days trying to reach his younger brother Thomas, who had been working the lower shaft when the collapse happened. Thomas Stone had been only 14 years old, just a boy really, working alongside his older brother to help support their widowed mother back in Kansas, and when the mountain came down, Josiah had refused to stop digging even when his hands bled and his muscles screamed, and other men begged him to accept what everyone else already knew. They had pulled Josiah away by force on the 4th day, when they finally reached Thomas's body crushed beneath a support beam, and according to witnesses, Josiah had let out a sound that wasn't quite human before going completely silent in a way that suggested something fundamental had broken inside him. He had left the mining camp that very night and arrived in Silver Ridge a week later, taking work as a ranch hand and stable keeper, never speaking about what had happened, and never going anywhere near the mines that dotted the hills around town. Everyone knew that Josiah Stone had sworn some kind of private oath to never set foot near a mine again, that the Whitmore specifically held ghosts too painful for him to face. And yet here he stood making a promise to an 8-year-old girl that would require him to walk straight back into the nightmare that had destroyed him a decade ago. Gerald Hutchins stared at Josiah with a mixture of respect and horror, understanding better than anyone what this decision was costing the giant cowboy, because Hutchins had been the one to hand Thomas Stone's battered lunch pail to Josiah after they recovered the body, and he had seen the light go out in the older brother's eyes when he accepted it. Now Josiah was going to walk back into that darkness, back into the collapsed tunnels and unstable shafts and suffocating terror of being buried alive, all to save a 15-year-old girl he had never met because she was the same age his brother had been when the mountain took him. Josiah turned away from the crowd without another word and began striding toward the edge of town where the Whitmore mine sat like a scar on the hillside, his long legs covering ground so quickly that Emma had to run to keep pace beside him, her small hand clutching the hem of his duster, as if afraid he might disappear if she let go. Behind them, Doc Patterson made a decision that surprised even himself and called out that he was coming too, grabbing his medical bag from his office as he hurried to catch up, and 3 other men broke from the crowd to follow as well, including young Michael Brennan, who worked at the livery, old Samuel Cross, who had lost his own son to a mining accident years before, and Jacob Walsh the blacksmith, whose strong arms might be needed if heavy lifting was required. The walk to the mine took 15 minutes along the dusty road that led out of town, and in that time Emma's natural curiosity overcame some of her fear as she looked up at the giant man beside her and asked in a small voice if he had ever been in a mine before, and Josiah's jaw clenched visibly before he answered. "I worked the Whitmore for 2 years," he said quietly, "back when I was younger and thought I could make enough money to buy land for my family." Emma processed this information with the straightforward logic of a child and asked if that was why he knew he could save Clara, because he understood mines, and Josiah was silent for so long that she thought he might not answer until he finally spoke again in a voice barely above a whisper. "I had a brother," he said, and Emma immediately asked what his name was with the innocent directness that adults lose somewhere along the way. "Thomas," Josiah replied, and the name seemed to catch in his throat like a physical thing. "He was 14 years old when the Whitmore collapsed 10 years ago, same age as your sister is now." Emma's eyes went wide as she understood what he was telling her, and she asked in a voice filled with hope if Josiah had saved Thomas from the cave-in, if that was why he knew he could save Clara too. The silence that followed was heavy with grief as Josiah shook his head slowly, and when he spoke again, his words carried the weight of a decade of guilt and sorrow. "I dug for 3 days," he said, his massive hands flexing unconsciously at his sides, as if remembering the feeling of tearing through rock and timber. "I dug until my hands bled and my arms gave out and other men had to pull me away because I would not stop, could not stop even when they told me there was no hope left. But I was too late, Emma. I reached him too late, and that failure has haunted every moment of my life since." Emma absorbed this terrible truth with the resilience of a child who had already learned that the world could be cruel and unfair, and instead of pulling away from Josiah in disappointment, she squeezed his hand tighter and said something that made his eyes burn with fresh tears. "Maybe God kept you alive so you could save Clara instead," she said with absolute faith. "Maybe Thomas would want you to save my sister." The words hit Josiah like a hammer blow to the chest, and Doc Patterson, who had heard the exchange, felt his own throat tighten with emotion as they crested the final hill and saw the Whitmore mine waiting below them like a mouth open to swallow them all. The Whitmore mine entrance sat at the base of a scrub-covered hillside about half a mile from the edge of town proper, marked by the weathered wooden signs that warned of danger and unstable ground in faded letters that had been painted a decade ago and never maintained since the closure. The collapsed section was immediately visible as a tumbled mass of rock, splintered timber and red clay earth that blocked what had once been a reinforced entrance tunnel, and as the group approached, Josiah slowed his pace and began studying the rubble with the practiced eye of someone who had spent years working underground and understood the language of stone and earth. Emma broke away from his side and threw herself at the pile of debris, pressing her ear against the rocks and calling out her sister's name with desperate urgency, her small voice echoing off the hillside as she shouted Clara over and over, while the men behind her stood in uncertain silence. For a long moment there was nothing but the sound of Emma's cries and the whisper of wind through the scrub brush, and then a faint voice responded from somewhere deep within the collapsed tunnel, weak and muffled but unmistakably human, and the sound made everyone freeze in place. Clara's voice called back that she was trapped but alive, that her legs were pinned but she could breathe, and the relief that washed over Emma's face was so intense that Doc Patterson had to steady her before she collapsed. Josiah's jaw clenched with determination as he stripped off his long duster coat and tossed it aside, revealing arms corded with muscle and a work shirt that had seen better days, and he moved closer to the rubble pile with the careful precision of a man reading a text written in a language only he understood. His massive hands traced the edges of fallen timbers and tested the stability of larger rocks, his eyes calculating angles and weight distribution, and structural integrity with expertise born from years of experience in exactly this kind of dangerous situation. The entrance had collapsed in a pattern that Josiah recognized from other cave-ins, with the support beams failing first and bringing down the overhead rock in a cascade that had left the main debris pile leaning slightly to the left where the original tunnel structure still provided some minimal support. He knelt down and pressed his ear to a gap between two large stones, listening for sounds of shifting earth or groaning timber that would indicate imminent further collapse, and what he heard made his expression darken with concern because there were subtle creaks and pops that suggested the entire structure was still settling. Doc Patterson moved beside him and asked in a low voice if it was as bad as Gerald Hutchins had suggested, and Josiah nodded slowly while his mind worked through possibilities and calculations, weighing the risk of triggering a larger collapse against the certainty that Clara would die if they did nothing. And finally he spoke in that rough, unused voice that carried absolute conviction despite the fear that anyone with sense would feel looking at this death trap. Gerald Hutchins arrived within minutes, breathing hard from the climb up the hillside, and behind him came what looked like half the town of Silver Ridge, drawn by the drama unfolding at the forbidden mine entrance and by morbid curiosity about whether they were about to witness a rescue or a tragedy. Hutchins pushed through the gathering crowd and grabbed Josiah's shoulder with enough force to spin a smaller man around, his face red with anger and fear as he demanded that Josiah stop this madness before he killed everyone involved and brought down the entire hillside in the process. The confrontation that erupted was immediate and heated, with Hutchins pointing at the unstable rubble pile and explaining to the assembled townspeople that any attempt to dig through that collapse was suicide, pure and simple, that the vibrations alone would trigger secondary collapses throughout the connected tunnel system, and that Josiah Stone's grief over his dead brother was clouding his judgment to the point of recklessness. Josiah listened to the foreman's tirade without interruption, his massive frame utterly still until Hutchins finished, and then he spoke in that rough voice with a clarity that came from years of underground experience that matched or exceeded the foreman's own expertise. The collapse is relatively fresh, Josiah explained, which means the debris has not fully settled and compacted yet, and if they work carefully with proper timber supports placed every 3 feet as they excavate, they can create a stable tunnel through the rubble without triggering the kind of cascade failure Hutchins was describing. He pointed to specific sections of the pile, where the original support beams were still partially intact, and explained how those could be reinforced and used as anchor points for new supports. And his technical knowledge was detailed enough that several men in the crowd who had mining experience nodded in reluctant agreement that his plan might actually work. But Mayor Blackwood pushed forward at that moment, a portly man in a fine suit who had never worked a day underground in his life, and he announced with political authority that the town could not sanction such a dangerous rescue attempt when professional miners from Cedar Falls could be here within 6 hours to assess the situation properly and determine the safest course of action. 6 hours, Josiah repeated, and his voice carried such contempt that the mayor actually stepped backward. That girl has been trapped for over 2 hours already in darkness, with limited air, and you want to wait 6 more hours for miners who will likely tell you the same thing Gerald just did, that it is too dangerous and she should be left to die. Emma let out a sob at those words and clutched at Josiah's leg, and Doc Patterson spoke up from where he stood examining the rubble, his medical expertise lending weight to his opinion that 6 hours without adequate air circulation in an enclosed space would likely result in suffocation or oxygen deprivation severe enough to cause permanent brain damage, even if Clara survived. The crowd began murmuring among themselves, split between those who feared the danger of immediate action and those who could not stomach the idea of leaving a 15-year-old girl to die slowly in the dark while they waited for permission and experts and proper procedures that might come too late to matter. The arguments between Mayor Blackwood and Gerald Hutchins and various townspeople swirled around the mine entrance like dust devils, voices rising and falling in debate about liability and safety and proper procedure, when Emma Hartwell's small voice cut through all of it with a desperate cry that struck every person present like a physical blow. "Please," she screamed, tears streaming down her dirt-stained face as she looked from one adult to another. "She's all I have left." The raw anguish in those words silenced every argument and calculation, stripping away all the political considerations and safety protocols and bureaucratic delays to reveal the simple human truth at the heart of the situation, that a child was dying in the darkness while adults stood in the sunlight debating the proper forms to fill out. Josiah Stone heard those words, and something fundamental shifted in his expression, the last traces of hesitation burning away to leave only absolute determination. And he turned away from the mayor and the foreman and strode to where a pile of salvaged timber beams lay stacked near the old mine works. What happened next would become legend in Silver Ridge, told and retold in saloons and general stores for decades to come, because Josiah bent down and gripped a 12-foot support beam that normally required 3 strong men to lift and carry, and he hoisted it onto his shoulder single-handedly, as if it weighed no more than a fence post. The crowd fell silent as he carried that massive timber to the collapsed entrance and positioned it at a precise angle against the rubble pile, bracing it against solid rock on one side and driving the base deep into the earth with several powerful strikes of his boot heel, creating the first support of what would become a tunnel through the collapse. Then Josiah picked up a shovel that looked like a child's toy in his enormous hands and began removing rocks and debris with careful precision. And as he worked, he spoke in that rough voice that carried absolute authority born from years of experience in situations exactly like this one. "Anyone who wants to help," he said without looking up from his work, "grab timber and follow my lead exactly." And the way he said it left no room for argument or debate, no space for mayors or foremen or anyone else to assert their authority over his. Doc Patterson was the first to respond, grabbing a smaller timber support and positioning himself where Josiah indicated with a jerk of his head, and then Michael Brennan from the livery stepped forward, followed by Samuel Cross and Jacob Walsh the blacksmith, and within moments a dozen men were working under Josiah's direction, despite Mayor Blackwood's buttering protests about liability and Gerald Hutchins' dire warnings about structural instability. The giant cowboy had made his choice, and his presence was so commanding, his knowledge so evident, his determination so absolute that the crowd found themselves following orders from a man who had barely spoken 10 words in 5 years. And as Emma watched these men begin the dangerous work of tunneling into her sister's tomb, hope flickered in her chest for the first time since the collapse. Doc Patterson stepped forward first, as Josiah had known he would, the physician's steady hands and calm demeanour making him the ideal second man for this dangerous work, and he positioned himself exactly where Josiah indicated, while gripping a timber support that would form the next crucial brace in their growing tunnel through the collapsed entrance. Jacob Walsh the blacksmith came next, his powerful arms and experience with heavy materials making him a natural choice for handling the larger beams. And then came William Turner, who ran the general store and had worked mines in his youth before settling into merchant life, followed by a steady stream of men who found their courage in Josiah's unwavering competence and the memory of Emma's desperate plea. Within 20 minutes, a dozen men were working in coordinated effort under Josiah's precise directions, each one assigned a specific task that fit into the larger plan he carried in his head, like a blueprint drawn from years of underground experience. Every 3 feet of forward progress required a new support beam to be positioned and secured, Josiah explained as they worked, because the weight of the collapsed material needed to be distributed evenly across multiple points rather than concentrated on any single timber that might fail under the strain. The men removed rocks carefully, rather than simply digging through, testing each stone before extracting it to ensure they were not pulling a keystone that held back tons of material above, and Josiah moved among them constantly, adjusting beam angles and checking structural integrity with hands that could feel instability through the vibrations in the wood. The tunnel they created was narrow, barely wide enough for a man to crawl through on hands and knees, but it was stable in a way that Gerald Hutchins had to grudgingly admit showed real expertise, and the foreman found himself offering suggestions rather than objections as the work progressed foot by careful foot into the heart of the collapse. Emma sat at the tunnel entrance on a flat rock that Doc Patterson had positioned for her, and every few minutes she would call out to her sister, her young voice echoing into the darkness with words of encouragement and updates on their progress. Clara's responses came back weaker with each exchange, her voice growing thinner and more distant in a way that made every man working dig a little faster despite the need for caution, because they all understood that time was running out for the girl trapped somewhere in that suffocating blackness. At the 15-foot mark, Clara stopped responding to Emma's calls altogether, and the little girl's face went pale with terror as she screamed her sister's name over and over without receiving any answer, and Josiah had to pause in his work to place one massive hand on Emma's shoulder and promise her in that rough voice that silence did not mean death, only that Clara had likely lost consciousness from lack of air, but could still be saved if they reached her in time. The work continued with renewed urgency as the afternoon sun began its descent toward the western hills, casting long shadows across the mine entrance where men dug into the earth to save a life, while a whole town watched and prayed and wondered if they were witnessing a miracle in the making, or a tragedy that would claim even more victims before the day ended. 20 feet into the collapsed section, the work had become brutal in ways that went beyond simple physical exhaustion, and Josiah's massive hands were leaving blood smears on every rock he moved, because the sharp edges of broken stone had torn through his calloused skin until his palms looked like raw meat. But when Doc Patterson tried to stop him and wrap the wounds, Josiah shook his head and continued digging, with a single-minded intensity that bordered on obsession. The tunnel had narrowed even further at this depth, forcing the men to work in cramped positions that made their backs scream and their shoulders ache, and the air had grown thick with dust that coated their lungs and made every breath a labour. But Josiah never slowed his methodical pace of removing stones and positioning supports and calling out instructions to the men working behind him. Then came the moment that would test everyone's resolve, a minor tremor that rippled through the earth like a shudder, lasting only 3 or 4 seconds, but long enough to send dust and small pebbles raining down from the tunnel ceiling, and cause several support beams to creak ominously under the shifting weight above. 3 men scrambled backward in immediate panic, their nerve breaking as they imagined tons of rock about to crush them into paste, and their retreat caused a moment of chaos as others considered following. But Josiah's voice cut through the fear with calm authority as he explained that minor tremors were normal in collapsed tunnels as the debris continued settling, and that the supports were holding exactly as designed. The men who remained, now reduced to 8 plus Josiah himself, pressed forward with renewed determination, born partly from courage and partly from shame at the thought of abandoning the effort when they had come so far, and Josiah directed them to add an extra support beam at the point where the tremor had caused the most stress. As they worked, Josiah noticed something that made his blood run cold with terrible familiarity. The angle of the tunnel was beginning to slope downward in a gradual decline that matched exactly the configuration of the shaft where Thomas had died 10 years before, and he shared this observation with Doc Patterson in a voice tight with suppressed emotion. "The downward angle means the air from the surface has to work against gravity to reach the trapped victim," Josiah explained. "And with each foot of descent, less oxygen makes it through the debris field, which means Clara's situation is becoming more desperate with every minute that passes, regardless of whether she responds to Emma's calls." Doc Patterson absorbed this grim information and asked how much time Josiah thought they had left, and the giant cowboy studied the angle of descent and calculated in his head based on experience and bitter memory before answering that they had perhaps 30 minutes before oxygen deprivation became irreversible, maybe less if Clara had underlying health conditions or had been exerting herself trying to free her pinned legs. The revelation spurred the remaining men to work faster despite the danger, their movements becoming more urgent even as they tried to maintain the careful precision that kept them all alive. At 30 feet deep into the collapsed tunnel, the darkness had become absolute and suffocating despite the lanterns that cast flickering yellow light across the cramped space, and the air was so thick with dust that every breath felt like inhaling ground glass. When Josiah's bloody hands finally broke through a wall of smaller stones into a pocket of empty space beyond, he thrust his lantern through the opening and saw Clara Hartwell lying on her side in a small cavity created by 2 support beams that had fallen in a cross pattern, her face pale as death and her eyes squinting against the sudden light, but unmistakably alive and conscious despite the massive timber beam that lay across both her legs, pinning her to the ground. Josiah's entire body went rigid as the scene before him triggered memories he had spent 10 years trying to bury, because this was exactly how they had found Thomas, trapped under a fallen beam in a small pocket of space that had kept him alive just long enough to die slowly, while his brother dug frantically toward him through tons of rock. Clara's lips moved and she whispered something too quiet to hear, and Josiah had to force himself to crawl through the narrow opening he had created, his massive frame barely fitting through the gap as he pulled himself into the pocket where she lay trapped. His voice cracked completely when he spoke, all the carefully controlled emotion of the past 2 hours breaking through as he positioned himself beside her, and placed one bleeding hand on her shoulder with a gentleness that seemed impossible for someone his size. "I've got you, little one," he said, and tears were streaming down his dust-covered face, leaving clean tracks through the grime. "Just like I couldn't get him." The words came out raw and broken, carrying the full weight of a guilt that had haunted every moment of the past 10 years, the knowledge that he had failed his brother in the most fundamental way possible, and that failure had defined everything he had become since. Clara's eyes focused on his face with surprising clarity given her situation, and she whispered that she knew who he was, that Emma had told her about the giant cowboy who never spoke, and she asked in a voice barely audible if he was Thomas's brother. The question hit Josiah like a physical blow because he had not heard anyone speak his brother's name in years, and he nodded slowly while his hands moved to examine the beam across her legs, checking for crush injuries and blood loss with the careful precision Doc Patterson had taught the rescue workers 10 years ago. "You're the same age he was," Josiah said quietly, 14 years old and trapped in the dark, and I swore after losing him that I would never go near a mine again, that I could not bear to face this kind of darkness and fear and helplessness ever again in my life. But your sister asked me for help, and I saw Thomas in her eyes, saw the same desperation and faith that maybe someone could save what seemed lost, and I realized that maybe the only way to honor his memory was to do for you what I could not do for him." Josiah positioned himself at the end of the massive timber beam that trapped Clara's legs, his bleeding hands finding purchase on the rough wood, while Doc Patterson squeezed through the narrow opening behind him, with his medical bag clutched against his chest. The beam was easily 200 pounds of solid oak, part of the original mine support structure that had failed during the collapse, and in the confined space of the pocket, there was barely room for Josiah to brace his legs properly before attempting the lift. He took 3 deep breaths to center himself, then drove upward with every ounce of strength his enormous frame possessed, the muscles in his back and shoulders bunching like steel cables as he raised the beam, inch by agonizing inch, while his hands left bloody prints on the wood. Clara gasped as the pressure released from her legs, and Doc Patterson immediately moved to pull her clear of the danger zone, his experienced hands running over her limbs, checking for breaks and arterial damage, while Josiah held the beam aloft with arms that trembled from the sustained effort. The doctor worked quickly, his fingers probing Clara's ankles and shins with professional efficiency, and after what felt like an eternity but was probably only 30 seconds, he called out that Josiah could lower the beam because the girl was clear. The timber came down with a heavy thud that sent dust billowing through the pocket, and Josiah collapsed against the wall for a moment, his chest heaving as he fought to catch his breath while Doc Patterson continued his examination by lantern light. The verdict came quickly and brought a wave of relief that made Josiah's eyes burn with fresh tears, because Doc Patterson announced that Clara had a broken ankle and severe bruising but no arterial bleeding, no compound fractures, nothing that would prevent her from making a full recovery, given proper rest and treatment. Josiah moved to where Clara lay and slipped his arms beneath her slight frame, lifting her as gently as if she were made of spun glass despite his own exhaustion and injuries, and as he cradled her against his chest, she looked up at his tear-streaked face and whispered, "Thank you," in a voice filled with more gratitude than he felt he deserved. "Your sister saved you by being brave enough to ask for help," Josiah responded, his voice breaking on every word as tears mixed with the dust coating his face, something I couldn't do when it mattered most, and in that moment he understood a truth that had eluded him for 10 years. When Thomas had been trapped, Josiah had tried to save him alone, had refused offers of help from more experienced miners, had let pride and grief cloud his judgment until it was too late. But Emma had done what he could not. She had swallowed her pride and asked a stranger for help, despite having no guarantee he would respond. That simple act of courage, of vulnerability, of trusting others when you could not succeed alone, was the lesson Thomas's death had been trying to teach him all along, and it had taken a desperate 8-year-old girl to finally break through the wall of guilt and silence he had built around himself. The journey back through the tunnel they had carved into the collapsed entrance was even more dangerous than the initial dig, because now they were carrying an injured girl through a passage that had been stressed by their forward progress, and Josiah understood that every movement, every shifted beam, every displaced rock increased the risk of catastrophic failure that would bury them all. He cradled Clara against his chest with arms that had gone numb from sustained effort, positioning her body so that her broken ankle would not strike the tunnel walls as they crawled backward through the narrow passage, and his voice never stopped issuing instructions to the men working around him about where to place additional support beams and which sections of the tunnel needed reinforcement before they passed through. Doc Patterson led the way backward with a lantern, calling out warnings about low clearances and unstable sections, while Jacob Walsh and William Turner followed behind Josiah, adding extra timber supports every few feet to ensure the tunnel would not collapse on the men still working deeper in the shaft. The 45 minutes it took to extract Clara felt like hours to everyone involved, each foot of progress earned through careful coordination and constant awareness that one mistake could kill them all, and twice they had to stop completely while Josiah directed the placement of emergency supports when sections of the tunnel began showing signs of imminent failure. Emma's voice carried into the darkness from the entrance, calling out encouragement and asking if they were close, and Josiah would respond with updates on their progress, even though speaking required breath he could barely spare in the oxygen-depleted air. When Josiah's head finally emerged from the tunnel entrance into the golden light of late afternoon, the assembled crowd of townspeople let out a collective gasp, followed by absolute silence as they watched the giant cowboy pull himself and the girl in his arms free from the earth that had tried to claim her. Emma Hartwell did not wait for propriety or permission, but threw herself at both Josiah and her sister with such force that she nearly knocked them both over, her small arms wrapping around as much of them as she could reach, while sobs of relief and joy shook her entire body. Clara was crying too, her face buried against Josiah's shoulder, as the reality of her rescue finally hit her, and Josiah simply held both girls while his own tears flowed freely down his dust-caked face, mixing with the blood from his torn hands and the grime from 2 hours of digging through collapsed mineworks. The townspeople of Silver Ridge stood in reverent silence as they witnessed this impossible tableau, the legendary giant who had not spoken or shown emotion in 5 years now weeping openly while clutching 2 orphaned girls as if they were the most precious things in the world, and more than one hardened rancher or shopkeeper found themselves wiping their own eyes at the raw display of grief and redemption playing out before them. That evening at Doc Patterson's office on the 2nd floor above the general store, Clara rested on a clean cot with her ankle properly splintered and wrapped. The bone set as well as could be managed without the services of a surgeon from one of the larger cities, and the colour had returned to her face after several glasses of water and a bowl of hot soup that Mrs. Henderson had brought over despite her earlier anger about the bull incident that seemed trivial now in light of the day's drama. Emma sat beside her sister holding her hand with a grip that suggested she might never let go, and the assembled group that included Josiah, Doc Patterson, Sheriff Morrison, who had returned from his cattle dispute, and Mayor Blackwood, who seemed chastened by the afternoon's events, discussed the practical matters that needed addressing now that the immediate crisis had passed. It was during this conversation that Emma revealed something that made every adult in the room go still with anger, explaining in her matter-of-fact child's voice that their Uncle Silas had been trying for months to force both girls into the territorial orphanage over in Cedar Falls, claiming he could not afford to care for them, and that they would be better off in an institution. But Clara had overheard him talking to a lawyer about how placing them in the orphanage would allow him to claim guardianship of the small inheritance their parents had left, about $300 in a bank account and the deed to a modest house in town that Silas wanted to sell for drinking money. Sheriff Morrison's face darkened with fury as he listened to this tale of calculated cruelty, and he announced that Silas Wade would be answering some very pointed questions about his treatment of his nieces and his attempts to defraud them of their rightful inheritance. Josiah had been standing by the window looking out at the darkening street, his bandaged hands hanging at his sides, but at Emma's words he turned and spoke with a quiet certainty that surprised everyone in the room. "I'll be taking legal guardianship of both girls," he said, and the declaration was met with stunned silence before Sheriff Morrison asked if Josiah understood what he was committing to, the responsibility and permanence of such a decision. Josiah looked at Emma and Clara, these 2 orphaned sisters who had lost everything but each other, and he saw Thomas in both their faces, saw the brother he had failed and could never bring back. "I couldn't save my brother," Josiah said, his voice steady despite the emotion behind it, "but maybe I can honour him by protecting girls his age, by giving them the family and safety he never got to have." The words hung in the evening air like a benediction, and Doc Patterson found himself smiling through tears because he understood that Josiah Stone had finally found a way to transform his decade of grief and guilt into something purposeful and life-giving. That by saving Clara and choosing to protect both sisters, he was not replacing Thomas, but rather ensuring that his brother's death would not be meaningless. 6 months later, on a crisp autumn morning when the cottonwoods had turned gold and the air carried the promise of winter to come, the entire town of Silver Ridge gathered on the hillside near the sealed entrance of the Whitmore mine to witness something unprecedented in their community's history. Josiah Stone stood between Emma and Clara Hartwell, his massive frame somehow softened by the presence of the two girls who now called him guardian and father in equal measure, and together the three of them held a single pair of scissors poised to cut the ribbon stretched across the entrance to the new Whitmore Mine Memorial and Safety Training Center. The building had risen from Josiah's life savings, every penny he had accumulated in 5 years of solitary ranch work now transformed into timber and stone and glass that would serve generations of miners yet to come. And inside those walls he had created a space where men could learn proper shoring techniques and emergency procedures and all the hard-won knowledge that might prevent future tragedies like the one that had taken his brother. Clara stood tall on her healed ankle with no trace of a limp remaining from her ordeal, her face bright with pride as she looked up at the man who had crawled into darkness to save her life, and then chosen to make that salvation permanent by becoming the father she and Emma had lost. Emma squeezed Josiah's hand as they cut the ribbon together, and the gathered crowd erupted in applause that echoed across the valley, a sound of genuine celebration mixed with the kind of reverence people reserve for moments when they witness transformation that goes beyond mere physical rescue. Sheriff Morrison stood in the front row beside Doc Patterson, and even Gerald Hutchins, who had admitted weeks ago that Josiah's rescue technique had been sound and his courage beyond question, and Mayor Blackwood gave a speech about community and sacrifice that felt less hollow than his usual political pronouncements, because everyone present had seen what real sacrifice looked like. The bronze plaque mounted beside the entrance caught the morning sunlight as people filed past to read the inscription that Josiah had composed himself after many nights of careful thought, and the words carried a weight that brought tears to more than one weathered face. In memory of Thomas Stone and the 12 men lost, may we honour them by saving those who come after. The simple statement captured everything that Josiah had learned in his journey, from grief-stricken silence to purposeful speech, from isolated guilt to community connection, from a man who could not save his brother to a father who would spend his remaining years ensuring that other brothers and sons and fathers might come home safe from the darkness underground. As the ceremony concluded and people began filing into the training center to examine the equipment and diagrams Josiah had prepared, Emma looked up at him and asked in her direct child's way if he thought Thomas would be proud of what they had built together, and Josiah knelt down between both girls with tears in his eyes and told them that he believed Thomas had sent them to him, so that all three of them could find the family they needed, that sometimes the greatest honour we can give the dead is to live fully and love fiercely and protect those who need protecting, and that yes, he believed his brother was proud not just of the building, but of the man Josiah had finally become.